Good morning. So today I'm going to be reading the first part of a book that I intend to read through all the way over time. The book is called The History of the International, 1864 to 1914, by Julius Braunthal. It's actually the first volume of, I believe, a 3-volume series of books dealing with the history of the international, or the internationals, going further on into their history beyond 1914. I haven't read the second, and I think there is a third volume as well. I haven't read those before. I've heard some not so great things about those. Not, I don't want to be prejudiced. I probably will get to them eventually. But the later history after 1914 is, I would say, significantly easier to mishandle, especially from someone of Bronthal's generation. This was originally published in German in 1961, translated into English in 1966. So it's informed by sort of the old left generation, but is appears in that kind of new left period, as an early proto or even pre-new left moment. But I find this first volume to be quite good, a quite good background on socialism internationally, and for that matter, the international as in both the first and the second internationals, as the organized expressions of that movement as a whole. So I'm going to go ahead and just start reading, and I'm going to try to get through the first few chapters today. The first few chapters are shorter. We'll see how far I'm able to get. Right, so let's begin. The preface begins. This study is an attempt at a comprehensive history of the International. No historian will fail to acknowledge the idea of socialism and its movement as one of the great intellectual, moral, and social forces of society. But surprisingly enough, while books on the history of socialist ideas and socialist movements constitute a rich and ever-expanding library, up to now there has appeared no universal history of the International as the organized expression and moral leadership of the world socialist movement. There are valuable studies of particular periods. There is, above all, G.D.H. Cole's monumental 5-volume History of Socialist Thought, containing a history of the First and Second Internationals, presented against a general background of the development of socialist ideas and movements. However, even in this comprehensive history of socialism, the International can be traced as only one among a larger number of its aspects. This is the first of 3 volumes devoted to the narration of the story of the International from its inception up to the centenary of the founding of the First International. 2 of these volumes have already been written and published in Germany, and the English versions of the 2 books present a revised edition of their German original. The 3rd volume, destined to conclude the story, is in preparation. In an attempt to ascertain the origin of the International, I went further back in tracing its root than the prevailing view of some historians would allow. Communist historians, in particular, insist that the historic International, known as the First, had only a single forerunner, the Communist League with which Karl Marx was associated. But, in fact, there were, as the investigations clearly show, a number of working-class associations aiming at an international brotherhood of the dispossessed, which came into being before the Communist League emerged in the late 1840s, and after its demise in the beginning of the 1850s. They were imbued, like the Communist League, with socialist ideas, which emanated ultimately from the humanitarian ideals of the French Revolution of 1789. The Communist League, indeed, before Marx joined it in 1847, scarcely differed in its ideology and social composition from its predecessors and successors among the forerunners of the International. It assumed its historical significance as the first distinctly proletarian forerunner of the historic International, only by the program drafted by Marx in his Communist Manifesto. But although the other forerunners lacked such a concrete socialist program, they were guided by precisely the same aim as the Communist League: the establishment of a fraternity of the workers in all countries in their struggle for a socialist society. Thus, Part 1 of the present volume, starting with an examination of the significance of the ideas of the French Revolution of 1789, is devoted to the forerunners of the International, their characteristics, beliefs, and traditions, which became embodied in the historic International. Part 2 covers the history of the First International up to the Hague Congress of 1872, and Part 3 the history of the Second International up to its collapse at the outbreak of the First World War. The second volume, starting with an investigation of the deeper reasons of the crisis of the International, narrates the history both of the socialist and communist internationals, up to their dissolution during the Second World War. During this period, the history of the labor movement was dominated by the conflict between Bolshevism and social democracy. It was over this fundamental difference of ideology that the International split. Each of these two internationals, formed in the process of this bifurcation, has, of course, its own history. But the history of the one, as well as of the other, becomes comprehensible only out of the history of the cleavage of the original International, and their struggle as rivals for the leadership of the European working class. In that volume, the attempt has been made to present the history of both internationals in the entanglement of their struggles against, and in the reciprocal effects of their actions upon, each other. It is intended that the third volume of this work should cover the period from the end of the Second World War to the completion of the International's first century in 1964. Just going to skip a little description of the appendices. So, Part 1. The Forerunners. Chapter 1. The Birth of the Idea. The Socialist International was born on the 28th of September, 1864. But the International Working Men's Association, the name by which it was first known, had predecessors whose ideas and traditions it embodied and carried farther. For a clear grasp of the spirit and history of the Socialist International, we must take the story back to the first of those predecessors. We can find the origins of the First International in the great movement for freedom and democracy, comprising many peoples, inspired by the French Revolution in 1789. This movement was decidedly international in its character, and was imbued with a feeling of international solidarity among the oppressed. It also brought about the first independent political movement of the working class in England and Scotland, while in France it gave rise to the first organization of militant socialists. The ideas which kindled the revolution in France, and through its rays lit up a movement for freedom in many lands, had developed much earlier in England, where the middle classes had secured a measure of civic rights and political freedom. There, feudalism had disintegrated many centuries earlier. The rights of the people and their equality before the law were guaranteed by long-standing custom and by a constitutional enactment, the Habeas Corpus Act of 1679. Absolutism could not therefore develop as strongly as in France, Spain, the Habsburg Empire, and the German principalities. Finally, and most undramatically, the Glorious Revolution of 1688 had abolished absolutism in all its forms, and divided power between king and parliament. At the time of the French Revolution, however, the power of the king was still very apparent, while parliament was dominated by the aristocracy. England was an oligarchy, and democracy was still an unrealized ideal, while the contrasts between wealth and poverty were sharper than ever. The French Revolution stimulated the aristocracy to challenge the predominance of the king, the middle classes to claim a share of parliamentary power, and the workers to resist the terrible forms of wage slavery arising out of the Industrial Revolution. For the peoples of the continent, however, the ideas of the French Revolution had a different and deeper significance. They were still subjected to a system of domination which rested on a complete denial of the principles of freedom and equality. In these countries, the principle that all authority stems from divine right was still undisputed. According to this theory, the king had been called to his throne by the grace of God, and all power, therefore, resided in the crown. The nobility and the bishops, through ancient custom, were entitled to share the wealth of the nation with the king. The common people in town and country were his subjects. And as all rights came from the king, every right enjoyed by the people of town and country was a gift of royal grace. The idea that men had rights by virtue of their humanity was utterly alien to the way of thought of a feudal society. Note, the idea of divine right was most explicitly defined by James I in a speech to the English Parliament in 1609. Kings are justly called gods, he told the assembled Parliament, for they exercise a manner of resemblance of divine power upon earth. For if you will consider the attributes of God, you shall see how they agree in the person of the king. God hath power to create or destroy, make or unmake at his pleasure, to give life or send death, to judge all and to be accountable to none. And like power have kings. They make and unmake their subjects. They have power of raising up and casting down, of life and death, judges over all their subjects, and in all cases, yet accountable to none but God. Frederick William IV, the anglicized Friedrich Wilhelm IV, of Prussia, had the same idea a good half-century after the French National Assembly had proclaimed the sovereignty of the people in 1789. In a letter to von Schoen, president of East Prussia, he said in 1841, "I feel myself entirely a creature of God's grace. Believe me, on my word as a king, while I reign, no prince or farmhand, parliament or Jewish school will take over anything which belongs, rightly or wrongly, to the crown, without my assent. A German prince should rule his regiment of subjects like a father, and since it is my birthright to reign over my father's domain, I fully intend to guide my immature children, chastise the backsliders, but let the good and worthy take part in administering my estate." That was Friedrich Wilhelm IV was the Prussian monarch who ascended to power when Marx was a young man. So that was in, I believe, 1840. And that was a pivotal moment in Marx's intellectual and political development. Something that I'm covering at present in the series of videos in which I'm reading Hal Draper's Karl Marx's Theory of Revolution on the Patreon page if you're a subscriber to that. So you can find out more about that. I mean, that will probably be discussed more later on in this work as well. So back to the main text. The Declaration of the Rights of Man by the French Constituent Assembly therefore challenged, in all these countries, the moral, ideological, and legal bases on which depended the social status, political power, and economic position of king, aristocracy, and church. It overthrew the principle of divine right, replacing it with the idea of a natural right, inherent in human nature, and revealed by eternal reason. It proclaimed the sacred rights of men. It declared men are born and always continue free and equal. It challenged the claim that kings derived their sovereignty from the grace of God, and declared the people collectively to be sovereign, the source of all power in state and society. Note, sovereignty resides in the people. It is indivisible, illimitable, and unchangeable. That's Article 25 of the Constitution of 1793. The French Revolutionary Constitution of 1793. Back to the Declaration of the Rights of Man. It proclaimed the Commonwealth, founded on the people's will, to be the natural constitution for society in France, as well as in the rest of the world. These ideas were not new. They were developed by philosophers and glorified by poets during the period of the Enlightenment. But now, for the first time in the history of Europe, they were proclaimed in the basic constitutional document of a state, moreover, in the foremost position which France occupied among the great powers at the time. To thinkers and poets it seemed that a wonderful dream was about to come true, that the reign of reason was just beginning, and that the revolution had opened the doors of a new era, an era in which states and societies would be molded in the spirit of the Enlightenment, an era in which men would live in brotherhood and perpetual peace. All who wanted an end to repression, political, social, and intellectual, identified themselves fully with the revolution. Kant, Fichte, Hegel, Schiller, Herder, Wieland, Hölderlin in Germany, Blake, Burns, Coleridge, Southey, Wordsworth in England, greeted the revolution with exuberance as a triumph of reason, justice, and social equality, as a creative force raising a world of freedom and equality out of the chaos of tyranny and superstition. My brethren, these are truths and mighty ones. Ye are all equal. Nature made ye so. Equality is your birthright, cried Southey. And Klopstock wished he had 100 voices to proclaim the birth of liberty. Many years later, Hegel described how deeply the revolution had moved him as a young man. It was a brilliant sunrise. Every thinking being celebrated the event. It was a time for noble endeavor. The world was full of spiritual joy, as if the Spirit of God had now become a reality in the world. And even Goethe, although he viewed with tranquil skepticism the processes of the revolution, avowed, deeply moved, "Who will dare to deny that his heart was exalted within him, and that his spirit, enfranchised, throbbed with a purer devotion when he beheld the first and the radiant glory of morning, heard of the rights of man to be shared in common with all men, learned of fair liberty, learned of equality, greatest of values. But the message of liberty and equality, the freshly awakened hope among the oppressed that a new era was approaching, naturally appeared to the ruling class as the grossest possible provocation. Driven by its own inner logic, the revolution had gradually embodied its original principles in the enactments of the French Constitution. It had abolished all privileges of birth and status, destroyed the nobility and the secular power of the church, deprived the king of his power, and finally overthrown the monarchy. This upheaval took place in the country with the oldest dynasty, a great power at that time foremost among the European states. The example France gave in raising the banner of popular sovereignty threatened every European dynasty, the entire European aristocracy, and the power of the church. The revolution was the common enemy of princes, nobility, and clergy, and they decided to stamp it out by force. Pope Pius IV had, in the spring of 1791, formally condemned the principles of the revolution, opposing the doctrines of the Church of Rome to the Declaration of the Rights of Man and Citizen. The émigrés publicly, and Louis XVI secretly, implored the crowned heads of Europe to defend their own cause. Armed intervention was considered in the cabinets of Vienna, St. Petersburg, and Berlin, and after Louis XVI, having failed to escape, had been removed from the throne, they were implemented. In the summer of 1792, the coalition armies of Austria, Prussia, and the German princes, to which the corps of fleeing French aristocrats and officers had attached themselves, approached the borders of France. With a manifesto in the name of the Emperor of Germany and the King of Prussia, the Duke of Brunswick, commander of the Allied armies, demanded the immediate restoration of the old regime. If Paris refused and resisted, he threatened her with a vengeance which would never be forgotten. She would be razed to the ground. Through the war of the Allied princes of Europe against revolutionary France, the revolution became the concern of all those in many countries who felt themselves victims of absolute governments. In the victory they saw the triumph of freedom in their own lands. In its defeat, the dreaded end of their hopes. Thus, in a good many countries, the French Revolution split the nation sharply in two. The international action of kings and princes, the war of the European coalition against France, blessed by the Church and supported by the conservative wing of the middle class, brought into being a democratic international. A section of the middle class, a few aristocrats, but a large number of workers and artisans in a variety of organizations corresponded with fraternal organizations across national boundaries and with the revolutionary clubs in France. They saw Paris, the heart of the revolution, as the center of an international society fighting for freedom. During those strenuous days, were not the eyes of all nations turned to the spot that so long had been the world's capital city? now more than ever before deserving that glorious title. Did not mankind wax strong in courage, in spirit, in utterance? Were not the names of those men who first spread abroad the good tidings equal in fame to the loftiest heroes among the mortals? Thus Goethe, and his lines reflected the prevailing atmosphere of the time. Even in 1799, when in France itself reaction had already set in and the revolutionary wars of liberation had degenerated into imperialist wars of conquest, Fichte still saw France as the fatherland of the upright man, since, he declared, the most precious aspirations of mankind were bound up with her fate. In France, the Girondists, as well as the Jacobins, were genuinely convinced that they were the pioneers of freedom, not only for the people of France, but for the whole of mankind. When the Constituent Assembly debated the draft of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, speaker after speaker referred to the universal character of the rights and claimed that they were valid for the peoples of all countries. They felt themselves linked in common struggle with the oppressed of all nations. They spoke of the brotherhood of peoples and demonstrated symbolically the idea of international solidarity. Thus, Lafayette handed the key of the Bastille, symbol of the vanquished despotism, to Thomas Paine, hero of the American War of Independence, and the French National Assembly ordered mourning on the death of Benjamin Franklin. In this spirit, the National Assembly conferred French citizenship on men of eminence in many a country. Washington, Wilberforce, Schiller, Klopstock, Pestalozzi, and Paine, among others, because they paved the way for the liberation of mankind. It was explained in the decree granting citizenship that although the French National Assembly could not hope to see as yet men establish by law what exists in nature, a single family, a single society, nevertheless, the friends of freedom must be dear to a nation which has renounced all conquests and proclaimed its desire for the brotherhood of nations. This was especially true at a time when a national convention decides the fate of France and, perhaps, prepares the future of mankind. The future for mankind. The princes had joined forces in a war against revolutionary France. The French National Convention called on the peoples to join the revolution against princes. In the convention, Robespierre moved that the constitutional law then under debate should declare France's complete solidarity with the revolutionaries of all lands. It should state, he proposed, that the men of all countries are brothers, and the various peoples should help each other, according to their strength, as citizens of one and the same country. The oppressor of one single nation declares himself the enemy of all nations. A more moderate version of Robespierre's idea was adopted by the Convention in the Constitution of 1793, Article 118, which said that the French people is the friend and the natural ally of all free peoples. In the life and death struggle in which France was engaged, she decided to carry the revolution into the enemy camp. Soon after the outbreak of the war against the coalition, the Council of Paris, the real leadership of the revolution, decided to ask the National Assembly to declare The nation renounces all plans of conquest, but it does not renounce the help of neighboring states which wish to extricate themselves from slavery. When a year later, the French revolutionary armies invaded the territory of the coalition powers, Danton proposed to the convention that the armed forces of France be appointed instruments of the revolution. For as long as we are surrounded by tyrants, he said, their coalition can endanger our own freedom. He further asserted that, in sending us here, the French nation has at the same time created a grand council to head the uprising of the peoples against all the kings of the world. The idea of France's armed solidarity with revolutionaries abroad was later embodied in the following decree by the Convention on the 19th of November, 1793. In the name of the French nation, the National Convention declares that it will grant fraternal protection to all peoples trying to win back their freedom. It gives authority to issue to the generals the necessary orders instructing them to help those peoples and protect those citizens who are, and who are likely to be, oppressed because of their love of freedom. Cambon, the convention's finance minister and one of the Girondist leaders, was asked to submit a draft of the procedure laid down for the generals in the occupied territories. The decree, put before the convention by Cambon and adopted on the 15th of December 1793, said basically that the aim of the Revolutionary War was the abolition of privilege. All privilege and all tyranny must be regarded as our enemy. In the occupied territories, where the people did not themselves overthrow the feudal system, France must declare herself a revolutionary power and destroy the old regime. The French generals were instructed to abolish immediately tithes and all other forms of feudal dues, as well as every kind of manorial right. All the old authorities were to be dissolved and replaced by elected provisional administrations, but only those citizens were to vote who undertook to maintain freedom and equality and forfeit all privileges. The generals were also to abolish the existing system of taxes and confiscate as security for the assignats all the property of the exchequer, the princes, and of secular and religious institutions. Should the elected administration be forced to levy taxes, it must take care that the burden did not fall on the working class. Many political refugees from abroad found asylum in revolutionary France. The clubs opened their doors to them. They secured posts in the National Guard and in the central and local administrations, and were even elected as representatives of the people. Thomas Paine and the Prussian revolutionary Anarcharsis Klutz were members of the convention. Thomas Paine and the Prussian revolutionary Anarcharsis Klutz were members of the convention. After the declaration of war, they formed the Foreign Legion, which was given the task, after the war, of freeing their countries from feudalism and despotism. There was a Belgian legion in the Northern Army, a legion from Liege in the Army of the Centre, a legion from Allobrogen, made up of men from Savoy, Geneva, Neuenburg, and Vaterland, and a Batavian and a German legion under the command of Colonel Dambach, who had served under Frederick II. The Foreign Legion played a major part in the decisive victory at Valmy in September 1792, which forced the Duke of Brunswick to retreat, and in the victory of Jeanmap a month later, which destroyed the power of Austria over Belgium. In some countries, the French revolutionary armies were received as liberators. "The advance of my army in Savoy," reported General Montesquieu to the convention, "is a triumphal procession. In country and town, people rush to welcome us. Everywhere they are wearing the tricolored cockades." The country was full of revolutionary clubs, inspired, as they stated in their resolutions, to throw themselves into the arms of the French Republic and form, with it, a single nation of brothers. A National Assembly of Allobrogen, with members sent from all the municipalities, deposed the King of Sardinia, overthrew the aristocracy and the rule of the landlords, confiscated the property of the clergy, and declared its wish to be united with France. Not everywhere in Europe did the population respond so vigorously to the revolution. But in several towns in the German states, in Switzerland, northern Italy, and even in Hungary, friends of the revolution formed themselves into secret societies, clubs, and study circles, into nests of democracy, as they were described in the German counter-revolutionary press. Speeches by the leaders of the French Revolution, reports of the convention's activity, revolutionary periodicals, almanacs, proclamations, and songs of freedom were distributed despite a strict censorship and threats of severe punishment. The decree on riots of the government of Saxony in 1791 threatened leaders and ringleaders who incite others to form an association and who produce or distribute seditious literature with death by the sword, and with circumstances aggravated the crime. And when circumstances aggravated the crime, death on the wheel. In some districts, invaded by French troops, the Tree of Liberty, the symbol of the revolution, was widely planted, and the old regime was overthrown in Belgium, the Principality of Lutich, the Diocese of Basel, Worms, and also in Mainz, which declared itself a republic. In some secular and clerical estates on the left bank of the Rhine, the peasants refused to pay tithes, contribute forced labor, or recognize other feudal rights. In Saxony, the peasants rose in 1790. In Silesia, they rose together with the weavers and artisans in 1792 and 1793. While in Breslau, there was a rising of merchants and handicraftsmen in April 1794. The revolutionary ferment, which had begun in France, spread over the whole of Western and Central Europe. But this ferment was unable to crystallize into mass revolutionary movements in countries still industrially undeveloped, because the social forces capable of bringing about a revolution in society were still in their infancy. The French Revolution was the work of a strong, self-conscious bourgeoisie, which was no longer prepared to tolerate its position as the third estate, and which claimed to be the most important class in state and society. It was also in revolt against the aristocratic structure of society, which had become a fetter on economic development, and it found support from a massive industrial proletariat in the suburbs of Paris, Lyon, and Marseille, which looked to the revolution for the fulfillment of its hopes and endeavors. Among France's neighbors, however, there was, except in Belgium, no strong industrial and commercial middle class, and no industrial proletariat. Italy and Spain were impoverished and exhausted. The German states at the time of the French Revolution were still agrarian, with a few industrial enclaves, such as the weaving districts in Silesia and the medieval homesteads of the handicraft cutlers of Remscheid and Solingen. Only a few German towns had recovered from the devastation and depopulation of the 30 Years' War. At the end of the 18th century, the population of Paris alone was greater than the total population of all the German free cities, including the university towns. The French Revolution, as we have seen, produced a powerful echo in Germany. But the social forces which could have transformed the radical, democratic, and cosmopolitan tendencies of the intellectuals and artisans into a revolutionary political movement were absent. So I'll at least get through chapter 2. I'd like to get through chapter 3 as well, but I do have a time limit, so we'll see how far I can get. Chapter 2. Thomas Paine, Internationalist. England provided fertile, if uneven, soil for the seeds of the French Revolution. There, some decades earlier, the Industrial Revolution had started, destined to transform the country into the workshop of the world. The process of industrialization inevitably strengthened the middle class in numbers, giving rise at the same time to an industrial proletariat. The ideas of the French Revolution had already been familiar there for 150 years. In the middle of the 17th century, England had risen against and destroyed the idea of the divine right of kings. For 10 years, from 1649 to 1659, under the Commonwealth of Cromwell, England had been a republic. In that period, Milton had produced his brilliant defense of free thought and a free press. By the turn of the century, the philosopher John Locke, in his treatise on civil government, had already deduced the existence of individual and civic rights from the prevailing theories of natural law. These ideas provided America with moral justification for her break with England, and inspired the Declaration of Independence of 1776, which was the prototype of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, proclaimed by the French National Assembly in 1789. Locke's ideas formed part of the intellectual climate shared by educated, liberal-minded men in England and Scotland. Such men greeted the French Revolution as a triumph of these ideas. Significant of the mood of the times was the enthusiastic reception given to a sermon by the highly respected Dr. Richard Price in London on the 4th of November, 1789, 6 months after the Revolution, or after the Revolution began. "I deem myself happy," he said, "to be able to witness such great times, when the rights of man are better understood than ever before, when nations thirst for freedom, when freedom's flames spread everywhere, and the rule of kings gives place to the rule of law. See the lands which, taught by you, have woken from their slumbers, broken their chains, and now demand justice from their oppressors. See the light you have kindled. It has freed America. Its light has spread to France, where it has kindled new flames, reducing despotism to ashes, while it warms and illuminates Europe." The speech was received by the meeting with wild applause. The Society of the Revolution of 1688 decided to send a message of greetings to the French National Assembly. It celebrated the 14th of July, 1790, and set up contacts with clubs in France. Price's sermon was so warmly received throughout the whole country that in a very short time, 12 editions were printed. Burke's book, Reflections on the French Revolution, was an attempt to refute Dr. Price. In its turn, it provoked Thomas Paine into writing what came to be a classic of English working-class literature, The Rights of Man. Note: a character sketch of Paine and assessment of his ideas can be found in Brailsford's brilliant work, Shelley, Godwin, and Their Circle. Sorry, some of these notes are substantive and some of them are a little more, a little less so. So I just try to read as many as catch my eye. Edmund Burke, a member of Parliament with great gifts as a writer and speaker, began as a radical exponent of Locke's theory of natural law. In his essay, A Vindication of Natural Society, he developed from the theory of natural law a charming socialistic critique of the existing social order. Consistently with this idea, he warmly defended the legal rights of the American colonists against the home country. But, as he grew older, he became reactionary. In his attack on Dr. Price, Burke no longer spoke of the inalienable rights of man, based on natural law. European civilization, he declared, derived its strength from tradition, whose guardians were the aristocracy and the church. He argued that it was the aristocracy and the church which held society together. Without them, it would dissolve into anarchy. A stable society, he maintained, could not be built on an inadequate, fallible human judgment based on abstract philosophical theories. It must develop organically out of custom and tradition, passed down from one generation to another. The French Revolution, in overthrowing the aristocracy, abolishing the power of the church, and destroying the heritage of tradition, had erected in their place the power of human judgment. In doing so, it had opened the gates to chaos. Burke expounded these ideas in powerful prose. His book was without doubt the most outstanding piece of anti-revolutionary propaganda of its day. It was translated into German by Friedrich Gentz, advisor to Metternich, as the most impressive refutation of the revolutionary idea. It became, and has remained, the gospel of counter-revolution. The year 1790, the year in which Burke's book appeared, also saw the arrival in England, via France, of Thomas Paine, already a citizen of 3 countries. Thomas Paine, born 1737 and died in 1809, proved to be one of the great figures of the English working class movement, its revered teacher for half a century, and remembered down to our time as a pioneer. He was born in 1737 in Thetford, Norfolk, the son of a poor staymaker and smallholder. Paine first learned his father's trade. Then, studying on his own, he gained a considerable knowledge of philosophy, politics, political economy, and even mathematics. Through the writings of Locke and the works on rationalism and natural law published by his English radical contemporaries, he became a fervent revolutionary. His ideas, were to develop a good deal further in America. Paine arrived in America in 1774 with a letter of introduction from Benjamin Franklin, whom he had met in London. From the outset, he had every intention of helping the settlers in their struggle for freedom. He arrived in Philadelphia, and at once threw himself as a journalist behind the colonists' demand for some control over their own taxation, in essence a fight of republicanism against monarchy, and of democracy against oligarchy. When the settlers finally rose against the mother country, Paine wrote in early 1776 an inspiring pamphlet, Common Sense. It was circulated on a huge scale and fanned the spark of revolution, which was already flickering, into a giant flame. When the pamphlet appeared, Americans were still wavering. Paine supplied them with arguments for the Declaration of Independence, which was duly proclaimed 5 months after the appearance of his pamphlet. The style of Paine's work, its fire, pathos, and revolutionary spirit, made him famous at once throughout America. Meanwhile, he enlisted as a private in Washington's army. He soon became adjutant to General Greene, then foreign minister to the American Congress, and finally secretary of the National Assembly in Pennsylvania. In 1781, he was sent by the American government on a diplomatic mission to Paris, where he befriended such men as Lafayette, Brissot, Condorcet, and others who were later to be leaders in the Revolution. When he returned to England in 1790, he was already a figure of European renown. Burke's attack on the French Revolution has already been mentioned. Paine at once undertook its defense in his work, The Rights of Man. In this book, Paine did not develop any original ideas. To Burke's view of the state and society, Paine counterposed the ideas of the natural law and rationalist school of thought. But these had previously been written in academic language. Paine wrote in a simple, clear style which could be understood by any working man. The philosophers of the Enlightenment had expressed their ideas in terms of cold logic. In Paine's writing, they glowed with a revolutionary fire and passion. Burke had denied the right of the people to make a revolution on the grounds that each generation was bound by the traditions of its predecessors. Paine denied the right of any generation to govern beyond the grave. Every age and generation, he declared, must be free to act for itself in all cases as the ages and generations which preceded it. The vanity and presumption of governing beyond the grave is the most ridiculous and insolent of all tyrannies. Every generation is, and must be, competent to all the purposes which its occasions require. It is the living, he insisted, and not the dead that are to be accommodated. To justify authority on the grounds of inherited right was a fraud against humanity. The people as a whole were the source of all power in state and society. There could be neither freedom nor social justice in the world until the people changed their constitution for one based on the principles of the rights of man, as had happened in France and America. Only when royal absolutism, the enemy of mankind and the source of all misery, had been abolished, and the natural sovereignty of the people reinstated, would an age of perpetual peace begin. Thomas Paine's The Rights of Man was the first political work in England to state the case of working people in their own terms and with concepts drawn from their own world of experience. It was also the first to express a program of social reform, which had wide popular appeal. The first volume of Paine's book appeared in 1791, the second a year later. It had a tremendous effect. In the course of a few months, edition after edition appeared. Before the government suppressed it as subversive, it had sold 200,000 copies and earned its author £1,000. He gave the money to the Corresponding Society, a working-class organization. Even after its prohibition, however, it continued to be produced and sold, though to do so involved the risk of a heavy prison sentence and transportation to the Australian penal settlement of Botany Bay. A warrant was issued for Paine's arrest. Warned in time by the poet William Blake, he fled to France, where he had meanwhile been elected to the National Assembly as representative of the people of Calais. He was convicted in his absence of high treason, declared an outlaw, and his book burned by the hangman. The Tories, whom Paine had escaped, found consolation in the genial device of TP nails fixed in the heels of their boots to witness how they trampled on his base principles and the hated name. But neither the hangman nor the abuse which aristocrats, bishops, and respectable citizens showered on Paine could lessen the popularity of his book. It served 2 generations of English and Scottish workers as their Bible. In it they found, as can be seen from their manifestos right up to the end of Chartism in the 1850s, the justification in natural law of their demands for political equality and social justice. The book does not belong to the history of socialist thought, but it belongs to the history of the International, because it implanted the idea of international solidarity for the oppressed deep in the minds and hearts of English workers. This can be seen in the Chartist paper, the Northern Star, in the speeches and writings of the Chartist leaders, Julian Harney and Ernest Jones, and in the program of the Society of Fraternal Democrats, founded in 1845, the real prototype of the International. I desperately want to keep reading. But I do think I have to leave off there, unfortunately. I need to go to work. I was just astounded when I read these pages the first time. Even knowing basically everything in them, I was just astounded. It's a very, I think hopefully you agree, and hopefully my performance of it did it justice, but I just think it's an incredibly powerful exposition of a history that we all know, at least in some respects and to some extent, but that we take for granted, and that really should burn within us like a fire that deserves to consume everything of this world that is long overdue to change, and illuminate the path to a new world still in the offing. That revolutionary spirit is still with us, but it's very, very difficult to discern or to recognize. It's obscured, it's muffled, it's... You know, the flame is still there in the embers, but the embers, to the touch, are cold. But sparks can still fly from embers. And flames can be reignited. Okay, I have to go. But I think I might continue with this tomorrow because it's just so good. Okay, take care.